The apartment was too quiet. It always was. The only sounds were the creak of old pipes and the distant hum of the city that never seemed to reach him. To the world outside he was invisible, and in many ways he preferred it that way. His name was Elijah, though no one had spoken it aloud in months. At 52, his face carried the kind of weariness that came from more than just age. Years of being overlooked, judged, and betrayed had carved deep lines into his skin. His hands, strong but scarred, told stories he never spoke of. Stories of labor, struggle, and battles against prejudice that left him weary rather than proud. Every morning was the same. He rose before dawn, brewed bitter coffee in a chipped mug, and stared at the blank walls while it cooled. Work filled the daylight hours. Mechanical, repetitive tasks that paid just enough to keep his body alive but did nothing for his soul. In the evenings, he sat in the same faded armchair, eating canned meals in silence. He rarely spoke to neighbors. Not because he hated them, but because he'd long stopped believing anyone wanted to hear his voice. People had passed through his life like shadows, some taking, some wounding, few staying. Loneliness was no longer a feeling. It had become the air he breathed. Elijah didn't expect change. He didn't dream anymore, didn't plan for tomorrow. He had built his life into a fortress of silence, safe from hurt but also safe from hope. And yet, fate has a way of breaking into even the most guarded lives. Elijah had no idea that tonight, with the rain pressing against his windows, the silence he carried for years was about to shatter. The storm had rolled in without warning. Rain pelted the cracked windows of Elijah's apartment, its steady rhythm filling the void of silence he had grown used to. He sat in his armchair, the flickering glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He almost welcomed the storm. At least it reminded him that the world outside was still alive, even if he wasn't part of it. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, like a stray branch tapping against the door. Elijah dismissed it, sinking deeper into his chair, unwilling to be disturbed. But it came again, sharper this time. Knock. Weak, uneven, almost desperate. He froze. No one ever came to his door. Not in years. His first thought was trouble. A neighbor in crisis. A drunk. Worse, someone looking for money or a way in. He had learned long ago that opening doors for strangers usually meant opening them to pain. The knock came once more, followed by the sound of something, or someone, slumping heavily against the wood. Cursing under his breath, Elijah stood. His body moved reluctantly, torn between fear and a faint tug of compassion he thought he'd buried long ago. He unlocked the door slowly, chain still fastened, and peered through the crack. There, in the dim glow of the hallway light, was a girl. She couldn't have been older than 17, her clothes soaked through, her face streaked with mud and rain. Blood glistened faintly on her arm where a torn sleeve exposed raw skin. She looked up at him with eyes half-lidded, lips trembling as if forming words she couldn't quite manage. Before Elijah could speak, her body gave way. She collapsed forward, and he instinctively caught her, startled by how light she was in his arms. Every instinct screamed at him to close the door, to avoid whatever danger had led her here. But the sight of her fragile, wounded form pressed against his chest pierced through the years of walls he had built around himself. With a deep, resigned breath, Elijah carried her inside. For the first time in years, the silence of his apartment was broken, not by his own choosing, but by fate knocking at his door. Elijah laid the girl carefully on the couch, her wet clothes soaking into the faded cushions. For a moment he stood over her, uncertain what to do next. He hadn't cared for anyone in years. The sight of blood and bruises unsettled him. He'd seen too much of both in his life, and they never ended well. Muttering under his breath, he rummaged through the bathroom cabinet for the half-used first aid kit he had bought years ago and never opened. The bandages were yellowed at the edges, but they would have to do. Returning to the girl, he cleaned the gash on her arm with shaking hands, the alcohol sting causing her to flinch. "You're safe," he muttered, though the words felt strange on his tongue, like he was saying them as much for himself as for her. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, filled with confusion but not fear. "Thank you," she whispered, voice raspy from exhaustion. Then she drifted back into uneasy sleep. Elijah sat in the chair across from her, watching the rise and fall of her chest. His mind churned with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she at his door and not someone else's? Suspicion gnawed at him. He had seen enough of the world to know that kindness often came at a cost. What if she had people looking for her? Dangerous people. What if the police came knocking, asking why he was harboring a wounded runaway? His solitary life had been hard, but at least it was predictable. Now, in the space of an hour, it felt fragile like glass about to crack. And yet, something about her fragile form disarmed him. She wasn't a threat. Not now. Not with the way her small frame curled into the couch cushions as though she hadn't known comfort in a long time. Elijah leaned back, sighing heavily. He told himself he'd let her stay just for the night. Just until she was strong enough to leave. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't that simple. Her sudden presence was already stirring something in him, he thought long dead. The dangerous pull of connection. The girl stirred as dawn's light crept through the blinds, painting faint stripes across the room. Elijah had barely slept, his mind restless with questions he hadn't dared to ask. When her eyes finally opened, she blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, then at him, sitting stiffly in the armchair across from her. "You're awake," he said quietly, almost awkwardly. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the pull of her bandaged arm. "Yeah, I guess I am." Her voice was soft, but there was a rawness to it, as though each word carried weight. For a while, silence filled the room again, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge. Elijah finally asked, "What happened?" The girl's gaze dropped to her lap. Her fingers twisted together nervously, as if she was holding back more than she could bear. I couldn't stay where I was," she whispered. Elijah frowned. "Where's that?" She shook her head. "Doesn't matter. Just not safe. Not for me." Her answer was vague, but the tremor in her voice told him more than the words did. He saw the bruises on her arm, the way she flinched when thunder cracked in the distance. He'd seen that kind of fear before, in others and in himself. "You running from someone," he pressed, his tone sharper than he intended. Her eyes flicked to his, guarded, then quickly away. "I just needed somewhere to go. Just one night. I'll be gone by morning." Elijah leaned back, studying her. She was young, fragile, carrying secrets heavy enough to bend her shoulders. And yet, beneath her fear, he glimpsed something familiar, an echo of the same hurt he'd buried long ago. He didn't push further. For now, fragments were enough. The truth would come when it was ready, or it wouldn't. Either way, she was here, and for reasons he couldn't explain. He felt a strange responsibility for her survival. Elijah found himself pacing the small apartment after the girl drifted back into a restless sleep. He told himself it was none of his business. She was a stranger, and soon she would be gone. But her presence had cracked something open inside him, something he had long worked to bury. Memories stirred, unwelcome, sharp as broken glass. He saw himself at 12, running barefoot down a dusty street as men shouted slurs he'd heard too many times. He saw his mother, weary and silent, holding together a house that had nothing in it but bills and disappointments. He remembered the sting of rejection when he tried to find work as a young man, the way store managers glanced at his skin before dismissing him. And then there were the betrayals closer to home. Friends who borrowed money and never returned. A woman he loved who once said she wanted forever, then walked out when forever meant struggling alongside him. One by one, people had chipped away at him until he stopped expecting anyone to stay. That was when he built his solitude. He worked, he ate, he slept. Nothing more. No risks, no chances, no attachments. If loneliness was a cage, at least it was a cage he could control. But now, watching the girl curl beneath his worn blanket, Elijah recognized the same shadows in her that lived inside him. The way her body tensed even in sleep, as if bracing for a blow. The way she avoided details, clinging to silence because silence felt safer than truth. He sank into his armchair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Why'd you end up here, out of all places?" he muttered. She didn't answer, couldn't. But Elijah realized it wasn't her silence that unsettled him. It was the mirror she held up, forcing him to remember the boy he once was, the man he had become, and the life he had locked away to protect himself. The shadows of his past were alive again, and for the first time in years, Elijah wasn't sure he wanted to hide from them anymore. Evening settled heavy over the apartment, the storm outside now reduced to a steady drizzle. The girl sat at the small kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, while Elijah moved stiffly about the stove. He hadn't cooked for anyone in years, and his hands felt clumsy cracking eggs and stirring a pot of beans. Still, there was something strangely grounding about the sound of food sizzling in the pan, the faint warmth of a shared meal filling the air. He set the plate in front of her. "Ain't much," he muttered, embarrassed at how meager it looked. "But it's hot." She gave him a tired smile. "It's more than I've had in days." They ate in silence at first. Elijah wasn't sure what to say. Words had never come easily to him. But the girl, after a few tentative bites, spoke softly. "Why do you live here all by yourself?" The question caught him off guard. He stared at her, fork hovering midair. "Guess I got used to it," he said finally. "People don't stick around. Easier to stop expecting them to." She nodded, as if she understood more than she let on. "I know what that feels like." For a while they shared fragments, nothing deep, but enough to fill the silence. She admitted she loved to draw, though she'd left her sketchbook behind when she ran. He confessed he once played guitar in his younger years, though the instrument now gathered dust in the corner of the closet. Their voices were tentative, but each word felt like brushing away a layer of dust from a long-forgotten part of themselves. At one point she laughed, quiet, unexpected but real. The sound startled Elijah, who realized with a pang that it had been years since laughter had lived in these walls. It loosened something in him, the hard knot in his chest easing just a little. Later, as she drifted toward sleep again, she murmured, "Thanks for not turning me away." Elijah sat back, staring at her fragile figure on the couch. For the first time in years, the apartment didn't feel suffocatingly empty. The silence had changed. It was no longer the weight of loneliness but the comfort of shared presence. That night, Elijah understood. He wasn't just giving her shelter. She was giving him something too. The reminder that he was still capable of care and maybe even of being cared for. The gray light of morning slipped through the blinds, soft but unwelcoming. Elijah stirred awake in his chair, his neck stiff from a night spent half sitting, half watching the girl sleep. She was already awake, sitting quietly on the couch, the blanket folded neatly beside her. Her eyes were clearer now, though tired, and her wounds looked less raw under the fresh bandages. "You should eat before you go," Elijah said, his voice rough from sleep. He motioned toward the kitchen. "There's some bread and fruit left." She gave him a faint smile but shook her head. "You've already done enough. I can't take more from you." "You ain't talking," he replied gruffly. "I'm offering." For a moment she hesitated, then nibbled at the bread he set out, her small hands holding it carefully as though it were something fragile. Elijah poured her water, watching her with a strange mix of relief and unease. When she finished, she rose to her feet. "I should go," she said softly. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Elijah's chest tightened. He wanted to ask her to stay, or at least to tell him where she was going. But the words caught in his throat. He wasn't her father, wasn't her savior, just a stranger who had opened his door one stormy night. At the threshold, she paused and turned back to him. Her eyes met his, steady now, carrying a weight far older than her years. "You saved me," she said. "But don't forget, you deserve to be saved too." The words hit him like a blow. Before he could respond, she stepped into the damp morning air and disappeared down the street, swallowed by the gray mist. Elijah stood frozen in the doorway, her words echoing in the quiet. He realized he was gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles were white. For years, he had believed his life was already over, just an endless cycle of days fading into nights. But now, with the sound of her voice lingering in his mind, he wondered, for the first time, if it wasn't too late to start living again. The apartment felt different after she left. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence Elijah had known for years. It carried her presence, her words, the faint echo of laughter that had once broken through its walls. Every corner of the room seemed touched by her memory, reminding him that he wasn't as empty as he thought. For days, Elijah caught himself listening for another knock at the door, though he knew she wouldn't come back. Instead, her final words haunted him. "Don't forget, you deserve to be saved too." He repeated them in his mind each morning as he brewed his bitter coffee. Slowly, they began to change the way he moved through the world. One day, he dusted off the old guitar tucked in the back of his closet. The strings were rusted, but as he plucked at them, a low, uneven melody filled the apartment. It was clumsy, but it stirred something in him, a piece of his younger self he thought had been lost. Another day, he found himself lingering outside his door when his neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, struggled up the stairs with her groceries. Normally, he would have turned away, pretending not to notice. This time he stepped forward. "Here, let me help." The surprise on her face melted into a smile, and for the first time in years, Elijah carried on a conversation that wasn't about work or necessity. Little by little, the man who had hidden from the world began to open his door again. He cleaned his apartment not just for function, but because he wanted light to reach the corners that had been buried in dust. He cooked meals with care, not just from cans, and even shared them once with a young boy from downstairs who knocked to ask for help fixing his bike. It was not a sudden rebirth. It was slow, fragile, with setbacks and doubts. But each step reminded Elijah of what he had forgotten, that living meant connection, risk, and the chance to be seen. The girl had left with nothing but her gratitude. Yet in return, she had given him something priceless: hope and the courage to believe he could start again. Weeks passed, then months. The world outside turned from winter gray to the first colors of spring. Elijah felt it in himself too. A thaw, a slow breaking of ice that had gripped his soul for years. His neighbors began to greet him with nods, then with words, then with warm familiarity. He surprised himself by joining them sometimes, sharing coffee, offering to fix a loose hinge, even laughing at a story. His laughter was rusty at first, but it grew easier with each attempt, as though it had been waiting beneath the surface all along. At night, the apartment no longer felt like a prison. Music returned to its walls, soft chords from his guitar filling the rooms. Sometimes he caught himself smiling without reason, remembering the girl's voice. Small, fragile, but sharp as truth. "You deserve to be saved too." He never saw her again. He often wondered if she had found safety, if she was still running, or if she had finally found a place that welcomed her. He wished he could know. Yet deep down, Elijah understood that maybe her role in his life was never meant to last. Sometimes people arrive not to stay, but to awaken what has long been asleep. Standing at his window one morning, sunlight spilling across his face, Elijah realized he was no longer invisible, not to himself and not to the world around him. The girl had come to his door wounded, desperate, seeking shelter for one night. But she had left him something far greater than he had given her. She had left him his life back. And Elijah, for the first time in years, was ready to live it.